Thank you, everybody, for being here. Okay, I am going to turn the program over to Zitzi Miraker, who is our second vice president and in charge of programs, and she is going to introduce Dan Wu. Zitzi?
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone again, and a special thank you to Dan Wu for being here. So just to give you all a heads up, so we'll be having a conversation with Dan. Please join in the chat, and if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, do that as well, and I'll try to keep an eye on time and sort of keeping everything moving and logistics running. So without further ado, thank you to at-large council member and Vice Mayor Dan Wu for being here. As you all may know, Dan was first elected to office in November 2022, and we have some questions for Dan about how it's been. Dan was born in China and came to the US as a child, first to Fargo, North Dakota, and then settled with his family here in Lexington. He's a graduate of Henry Clay High School, as well as the University of Kentucky. And Dan has been a jack of all trades, having worked in journalism, retail, restaurants, and other fields. Dan is a former board member of LexArts, the Human Rights Commission, Local First Lexington, the Equal Justice Center, and Civic Lex. As you can tell, he has been very active in our community and has worked on issues ranging from food insecurity to immigrant and refugee rights. Dan created both the I Am a Kentuckian and the Immigrants and Refugees Belong Here campaigns. And most recently, he was the owner and operator of Atomic Ramen, which is a restaurant with multiple locations in Lexington. Dan is married to Lauren, who is a high school teacher of kids with moderate to severe disabilities, as well as an LGBTQ+ advocate. Dan is father to daughter Sophia and stepdaughter Lily, and a trio of feline kids. In his spare time, Dan loves crosswords, jigsaw puzzles, binging bad sci-fi shows, and cooking for his family. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Our first question for you, as I alluded to, was we would just love to know what a typical day is like for you as an at-large council mayor and as vice mayor.
Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. There is literally no typical day for us on council in general, and particularly as vice mayor, which is kind of what I love about it. I am a person that gets bored really easily, and this job has not been boring for 1 second so far. So let's see. Let's take a Tuesday as an example. It's probably a little bit overfilled with various meetings. There'll be meetings with people within government, meeting with, let's say, a commissioner of environmental quality to talk about, storm sewers. It could be a meeting with someone from the community or from a nonprofit or from the library system, somebody who has an idea about something we're working on. And then we have 4 different subcommittees, or rather standing committees. I serve on 3 of them, and I attend the 4th one as well. We may have another working group that I might be chairing. Right now, we are in budget season, and we are in comprehensive plan goals and objectives season, which means I'm chairing a whole bunch of stuff. And it's all brand new to me. So it's been really interesting. And then we'll have work session. Occasionally we have a zone change hearing. So it really is, it's gotten to the point now where if you ask me what I'm doing tomorrow, I really couldn't tell you until I looked at my phone. And by 5:00 p.m., if you ask me, how was your day? I would have to look at my phone again to tell you what I did at 10 a.m. So all of which is say, I actually really enjoy it. And there really is no typical day. For council, Tuesdays and Thursdays are our busiest days with sort of all of our official meetings. But I'm kind of notorious for packing my schedule otherwise on all the other days as well. I try to take it a little bit easier on Friday and try to do some fun stuff, but there is no typical day.
Yeah, that's good to know for those of us who don't work in government. Dan, how do you decide? We appreciate you being here, given all of the meetings you go to. How do you decide, or who decides which meetings you go to? Sort of how are your priorities determined?
Yeah, so it starts with the obligatory stuff. So all the things that all the council members need to attend. So our work sessions, our council meetings, any committees that you're on. When you have zone change hearings, we have our special committees of the whole regarding budget, regarding comprehensive plan. We have a quarterly committee of the whole, which is elegantly acronymed CAL. So we have a lot of CALs. So we start with those. And then basically anything else we're working on or want to work on, we have various items in committee. So if we're interested in working on those, we attend those. And then from there, sort of community meetings and things like that. So prioritizing is a really, it's a fine art. It really is. I have a problem that I say yes to everything, or okay, I'm a recovering yes person. I used to say yes to everything. I literally cannot say yes to everything anymore. I have a terrific legislative aide, Tori, who really keeps me in line. When I start taking on too much, she'll raise an eyebrow and she'll say, okay, but have you looked at your week? And I don't even have to look at my week. I just say, okay, nope, you're right. Can we back this up? Can we not do it at all? Can we push it to next month? All those kind of things. So it's a kind of a balancing act. I've realized that, and I think for anybody with a busy schedule, whether you work in a nonprofit or a corporate situation or government, you really do have to set some good boundaries and preserve, if not hoard, some of your capacity, because it's really easy to get burned out. And it's really easy to kind of tap yourself out, and then you're no good to anybody. Then you're not as productive, you're not as creative, you're not as passionate and excited about things. So it's an interesting balancing act. I'm trying to juggle and really tweaking it every day.
Yeah, that's lovely to hear that, how you're learning and growing in this role. You talked about not being bored and how you enjoyed that. Is there anything else about the job that you particularly enjoyed or that has surprised you?
My favorite part of this job is that anytime I have a question about anything, particularly in government, I can go to the top of every food chain, so to speak, and get answers. I'll give you a concrete example. After the windstorms that we had last month, a constituent DM'd me on my Instagram account and sent me a video and a picture, said there's a electrical pole that's been sitting on my sidewalk for days, and those wires still seem to be live and they're going across my street. So I said, okay, I said, email exactly what you just told me to my work email. And then I forwarded on to our Commissioner of Environmental Quality and Public Works, because I specifically didn't know what department or division this would go to. So I just went straight to the top, and Nancy Albright, within probably an hour, responded to me, CC'd all the appropriate people, and within a couple of days, we got it taken care of. And this is a funny way to say it, but it makes me like almost mad with power to have that level of access to knowledge. And I'm talking about power, not like, Game of Thrones, like I'm going to take over the country, but having access to people who can get stuff done and know everything about everything is kind of amazing. And it really is a privilege, this job. And to me, it also speaks to how great a local government we have. We have so many just amazing civil servants and lifelong folks who work in the city, who I've never gotten a runaround from anybody so far. I've never had to wait a long time for a response from anybody about anything, even if it's hard questions, even if I'm really kind of coming after them about something like, hey, why aren't we doing this right? Or can we do this better? Everybody's been just super responsive. So I tell folks, like, if you get into city government in an elected official capacity, like city council, absolutely take advantage of that privilege and of that access to, help your constituents. So yeah, that's been really, really, really great.
Yeah, as a sort of citizen turned government official, Dan, what would you tell citizens like us who maybe aren't involved, that like it might not be obvious to us sort of from the outside about how city government works here in Lexington.
Yeah, I would say we are accessible in a way that state and federal officials very often, unfortunately, are not. You can come to council meetings anytime. You can grab us after, before. We answer our emails. We answer our voicemails. We come out to community neighborhood meetings and neighborhood picnics and public events. We're out and about, and we're just regular old people. We live here full time. And we're very accessible. And to me, if people have issues when they contact the city and they don't get a good answer, my suggestion is you don't give up. You go find another avenue, or you come to us. I mean, I hate to say it, but this is like a let me talk to your manager kind of moment. Like if you were getting the runaround from a division, go talk to your council member, because we can then go contact whatever these divisions are, and all these folks work for us and they will answer to us. So I would say, as residents and constituents of Lexington, you have access. We would like to do a better job of letting people know that they have this access, letting people know how to most effectively contact us. But by and large, I think we are a very receptive government and will continue to be so.
Yeah, great. Well, we are getting a lot of questions in the chat, which is great. And so I'm going to go a little bit off our script, Dan. So one question is around, people were intrigued by your bio and wanted to hear more about the two campaigns you worked on, the I Am a Kentuckian and the Immigrants and Refugees Belong Here.
Sure. I Am a Kentuckian, I think, was 2017. So it was just after a year that a certain person was elected to national office, and who was putting out a lot of hate and vitriol about immigrants, about refugees, about people, this inhumane language about, swarms of aliens coming over and taking over our country. And so I went to I think it was like an Immigrants and Refugees Day at the Capitol, maybe earlier that year. And one thing that I kept hearing from different speakers was they kept saying the words, I am a Kentuckian. And that really resonated with me. And so I wanted to create sort of a hearts and minds campaign that talked about where we are from originally, or what our national origins are, what our parents are from, but also tie it into the fact that, no, we live in Kentucky now, and we are Kentuckians, and you don't get to tell us that we're not. And so what we did is we created a video along with Kentucky for Kentucky. They helped out a lot with this project. And we had a bunch of people basically with sort of quote unquote foreign origins, some folks who are people of color whose parents were from somewhere else, but they were born here. And we had everybody basically say their name, say kind of where they're from, and then say, I'm a Kentuckian, and kind of layer that message over and over again. We created some t-shirts. We had a great event where we had performances and stuff. And then all the proceeds that came out of that went to Kentucky Refugee Ministries and Kentucky Equal Justice Center. And that was kind of like a moment for me where I realized, like, oh, you can do something. Like, you don't have to be in government, you don't have to be in power, you don't have to have a ton of money. You can create something that really, to me, tries to reflect and talk about who we are as a city. And so it's a statement of fact, but it's also an aspirational statement of, like, what kind of city do we want to be? So, a few years down the road, the rhetoric had not gotten better. In fact, the rhetoric had gotten worse, and there was kind of another wave of this anti-immigrant stuff. Our then president was trying to put some severe caps on immigration and on refugee numbers. So I kind of got motivated again. And this time I wanted to put something out into the city that really kind of put out a message of who we are as a city. And we do have a rich history and culture of taking in immigrants and refugees. So we came up originally with a slogan that was immigrants and refugees welcome here. And then I kind of sat down with the word welcome and I thought about it. And the word welcome means this is my house and I'm letting you into it. You are welcome.
Mm,
And I changed that word to belong, because when I say I belong here, I don't need your permission to tell me that. I
mm,
belong here because I belong here. And so we crafted that message. We did a little bit, I think we did a very, oh no, we had a grant. This was right after an On the Table. And so we applied for a micro grant, $2,000. And we went from conception to having these posters in business windows, I think in a 3 to 4 month window. And nobody was out of pocket. We used this grant money to basically print the poster and to pay the artists. It was Cricket Press, local artists. And we got it into a few hundred store windows. And then maybe a year and a half down the road, we printed t-shirts. And again, any print proceeds went to KRM and KEJC. And then finally, I was like, let's go really, really big. So I started contacting people I knew in the nonprofit industry and said like, hey, can I put a giant banner on your building?
mm.
And people jumped at it. So I got agreements from these 4 organizations, and then we did another Kickstarter, raised the money to print these. So now these big posters and banners are on the front of Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning, Living Art and Science Center, Pam Miller Downtown Arts Center, and then on the side of the parking structure at Broadway between Short and Main. And so, yeah, it really, to me, kind of proved the concept of like, you can get stuff done, you can get stuff done fast, and it takes collaboration, partnership, and just some hustle. So.
Yeah, that's great. Can folks still buy t-shirts or put signs in windows?
I still have a few signs sitting
Okay.
around. Definitely
Okay.
contact me.
Yeah.
Shirts are kind of a much more complicated beast, and I don't have any capacity to do that right now. Maybe
Yeah.
someday. I would honestly love, to me, I don't own this poster or this image or this concept. So if somebody else wanted to take it upon themselves to expand this program to another city, to a giant mural, whatever they want to do it, I would be so happy to hand it off and let somebody else, keep making it bigger.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to pivot us just a little bit. I'm going to still ask some questions from the chat. But so as you know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization, and we're working to expand voting rights and also civic participation more generally. So one question that came up in the chat is, and I guess let me back up and say another value of ours is transparency. So as you're thinking about your position now as a government official, what would you say to citizens about which committee meetings might be useful to attend? What are ways in which citizens can show up and learn more and get involved more with their city government?
Yeah, absolutely. So on an almost weekly basis, we have work sessions on Tuesday afternoons, 3 to 5, and then we have council meetings 6 to 8 on Thursdays. There's a full schedule on lexingtonky.gov. So those are great places generally to kind of just get a sense of what our process is, of how we go about our business. And those are the places where you can give public input on either things that are particular to that day's agenda, or just kind of generally, if you want to come talk about how our streets need paving or economic development or public safety, any of that, you can come and talk about it. We have those schedules are also up for all of our committee meetings. So if you are interested in public safety, come to the Social Services and Public Safety Committee. If you're interested in the environment or how kind of the city operates in a way that's environmental quality and public works, general government and planning has to do with kind of how our government functions, but also long range growth of the city. And then a BFED, budget, finance, and economic development. There are a lot of acronyms, by the way. You walk into and it's like alphabet soup city. It's kind of amazing. And then BFED is all about budgeting the city's finances and kind of looking towards how we grow the city economically. So those are the kind of the 4 main ones. But to me, it's just kind of keeping an eye on what's happening. You will also occasionally see announcements, public meeting announcements for, we're working on this particular proposal, we're working on tenants issues, we're working on the Crown Act, things like that. So anytime you see a notice like that, that means you can, as the public, attend these meetings and keep an eye. And that's a great place to engage with us. After the meeting ends, you can come up and chat with us and give us your thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, and so it sounds like the website is a key location. Are there mailing lists or other ways that citizens can find out about?
Yeah,
all
so
these
there's,
things?
excuse me, a lot of the district councils have their own email lists and newsletters. And then just this year, we have actually started a council-wide newsletter that can be found, I think, on the council page of our city website. And then you can also sign up for it and get on that mailing list. So that gives kind of an overview of some of the things happening in districts, but also just kind of what is happening in government. Here are meetings coming up. Here are things that have happened. Here's an expungement clinic. Here's a creek cleanup. Here's a reforest the bluegrass, all these kind of activities. So there are a bunch of different ways to keep up.
Great. To turn a little bit sort of broader to sort of talk about issues that are important to the league and I think also to many in government. One thing we're really interested in is expanding voting rights. And we're curious what you see as opportunities in our city or in our state to expand voting rights to more individuals.
Yeah, this is something that's very important to me, and I think it's very telling to see certain lawmakers on state and federal levels, anytime they try to suppress voting rights and anytime they try to make voting harder. That to me tells me that you don't think you can win fairly and you have to game the system. And my attitude is, if you, for example, are not winning, in partisan races on the state or national level, you need a better message. You need better candidates. You need better campaigns. You know what I mean? You need to play the game better. But instead, some folks see the avenue as let's suppress it, let's gerrymander, let's do all these things that give us the advantage. No matter how bad our candidates are, we can keep winning. So I am all for expanded voting rights. I think some of the things we put in during COVID in 2020 were fantastic. Those longer mail-in times where you didn't have to have excuses. It was a much longer period of early voting in a bunch of different voting sites. Excuse me. None of those things negatively impact the democratic process. In fact, they widen the process. They allow people who can't take off work on election day, a Tuesday, a weekday,
Right.
People who have to work long hours, who don't have childcare, all those kind of considerations. I really wish we could bring some of that stuff back. Elections, some elements of them are governed on the local level and some on the state level. I would love to see those kind of things widen. I'm a big fan of expungement, and I'm a big fan of allowing people with felony records to vote. So to me, just let's keep widening that as much as possible. I'll say one thing that's slightly tangential to it. One of the reasons that our local government works so well is that we are nonpartisan. The mayor's race is nonpartisan and the council races are nonpartisan. And what you see, this is a really kind of a brilliant contrast to what's happening in Frankfurt right now. Frankfurt right now, one party has a super majority, right? What happens when you have a super majority is you never need to make compromise and you never need to craft good legislation that passes muster because you can just do it. You have the votes. On city council, there are 15 of us. I would challenge folks to try to guess what parties we are, because I don't think you would get them all correctly, which I think is great. I am the sort of the ostensible leader of the council, but guess what? Unlike the Speaker of the House in Frankfurt, folks don't fall in line with me. I don't say jump and people don't say how high. I say jump and they say, well, maybe, tell me why. Every time we do anything, we have to go around to each other and convince each other and negotiate and compromise and talk to each other and work together. If I am for a particular idea or ordinance and I know that you're against it, you're going to be the first person I come and talk to and ask, well, why are you against it? What can I do to get you on board? What changes do you think need to be made? How do we balance this thing out? That to me is democracy. And that way we craft better legislation as well. So there have been attempts, and I think there will continue to be attempts at the state level to force our local elections to be partisan. And I think that's a terrible move. I know the reasons why they're doing it. It's not going to help them in Louisville or Lexington, but that's not why they're doing it. And I think it would only hurt. It would take the function out of our functional government. So I hope that doesn't happen. And I know Kentucky League of Cities also opposes it. So we will, if that comes up again in Frankfurt, we will continue to fight that.
Yeah, and that you answered a question that just came up in the chat, which is, what do you think about the state legislature trying to make local races partisan? One sort of related question around sort of getting local citizens interested in city government that came up sort of in our conversations was this idea of a quote unquote nightlife mayor, or a night czar that some bigger cities, New York, Boston, London have. So as someone who comes from sort of the restaurant and sort of more citizen-facing civic sort of social enterprises in our city, what do you see as a role of city government in promoting sort of, like sort of beyond just civic participation, sort of social life in our city more broadly?
I think a big part of it is, we as government, we show our priorities mainly by where we put our money. We can talk any kind of game we want about, we want to support X, Y, or Z, but if it's not in our budget, you kind of see where we really are on it. So for us, where we put our money is, put our money where our mouth is. So if we want to promote the arts, if we want to promote economic development, if we want to promote diversity in hiring or diversity in contracts, those are the places where we will push and put money towards. And I think that goes a long way to kind of crafting part of the culture of what we want Lexington to be. So it's kind of this might be kind of a vague or big answer to your question. But I think in a lot of ways, so I'll give you a more concrete example. We have a lot of conversations in government right now about sustainability. How do we potentially green up our vehicle fleets? How do we green our buildings? We're putting solar panels on, fire stations. We have that Solarized Lexington program that we're helping with. So, when the residents of Lexington see the government moving in this direction, it is somewhat a way of leading by example, right? We can't necessarily tell private businesses, hey, you have to put solar panels on, but we can show them the economic effects of it, or the cost savings of it, or just the environmental benefits of it. And then we can potentially put into our budget ways to help or encourage or subsidize folks to solarize or to go to more green, practices or vehicles, things like that. So I think we have a pretty influential role in kind of steering the city into sort of what kind of city do we want to be. And also, it's not just top down, where we have to be responsive and reactive to what people want us to be. If we realized that the city of Lexington did not care whatsoever about sustainability, right, we might have to reconsider a little bit. And we can't just necessarily force our will on the people if that's not where they want to go.
Yeah, and sort of on the theme of transportation and sort of citizens' interests, we have a question in the chat about if you have any comments from Monday night's build meeting, and the initiatives brought up there around providing 1% of the budget for affordable housing and a microtransit system.
Yeah, so the 1% has already been proposed and it's in the pipeline. I don't want to speak for other council members. I personally support that. I think it stabilizes that affordable housing fund, in that we don't have to kind of every year say, how much are we going to give this fund? It's kind of built in. And for critics who say like, oh, it's built in, so now we can't change it. Of course we can change it. If 2 years from now, a different council comes in and has different priorities, they can absolutely create another ordinance or resolution and change that. So everything we do to a great extent is reversible. But I definitely support that. I think that will stabilize it and also pretty much double what we have been historically giving it. In terms of transportation, that's always a little iffier because, our public transportation system here is LexTran, which is not a government agency per se. They're kind of their own thing, but we obviously collaborate and partner with them a lot. So I absolutely think that transportation is a vital piece of our idea of wraparound services, right? We may have great services that go towards food insecurity or mental health or substance use disorder, but if people can't get to them because they don't have cars, that's an issue, right? So it's something we're certainly working on. I don't precisely know at the moment, like what avenue to go about that. And it speaks to kind of a larger idea, like every idea we have, it can't just be like, what can government do? Or what do we need to create a new division? Do we need to buy some vans? There are so many nonprofits and organizations in this town doing really amazing work. And I've always been a big fan of figuring out who does the thing best and how do we support them, resource them, and amplify their work with our resources.
Wonderful. Another issue or topic that has come up in the chat is guns and gun safety, and sort of your thoughts and comments on that issue area. And I think a question that we had for you too is what you see as the most pressing issues. And so you may have already talked about some of those, but I just wanted to raise that.
Sure. The first part of your question, that has probably been the most frustrating thing about my job so far. Nothing on the local level has given me that sort of angst and anxiety the way that things coming out of Frankfurt and things coming out of Washington, D.C. do. And it's simply because of the way our system is created, we can't undermine or reverse things that happen at the state level. If the state says we can't do X, we can't do X. I mean, we can try, but it's going to get, it's going to get knocked down in the courts, and we're not going to be able to do it. So the things that are happening around guns, or let me say the things that are not happening around gun regulation in this country and in the state are absolutely infuriating. We've seen it all over the country. It's hit as close to home as Louisville now recently. And I'm sitting here honestly just waiting for it to happen in Lexington, because there's no, we're not special. We're not an exception. There's no reason that it won't happen in Lexington. And we're just waiting for it. And it's not even like we're waiting for it so we can do something about it. If and when it happens in Lexington, local government has almost no ability to do anything about guns. So all the conversations you hear about are basically fortifying schools or arming teachers or more, metal detectors. Right now, folks are constitutionally and legally allowed to either open or conceal carry into government buildings, excepting the federal courthouses. And that's mind-boggling to me. And so it is very frustrating. Ultimately, I do not think these things will change unless the makeup of our legislature changes. And even then, we have had, in our federal government, we have had years and years of Democratic presidents and Democratic Congresses, and still there's been very little action on guns. So honestly, it's very frustrating. And I'll kind of parallel this to a lot of the anti-LGBTQ stuff that's coming out of Frankfurt as well. That's also very, very frustrating, because I've had a lot of people reach out to me about that and say, what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about that? We can't come out and say like, hey, listen, we're not going to obey Kentucky state laws. We can't say that, and we can't do that. So the council recently, the majority of council recently put out that statement, basically in support of our LGBTQ community, because really all we can do is kind of show like we are not Frankfurt and we are not Kentucky. We are Lexington. We are a different kind of place. We support our LGBTQ plus community. We will do everything within our power to protect and affirm folks here, whether it's in the school system or just people in everyday life or the court systems. We do what we absolutely can. But yeah, that's one of those, it frustrates me every time I see stuff like that, because of the ideological differences between Lexington and Frankfurt, Kentucky. And sometimes I just have to kind of put my head down and just keep working on what we're working on. In terms of what the city's priorities are, housing is, to me, number one. Housing and land use and development and zoning, all those things are tied together. we have a severe housing shortage in Lexington, and it's nationwide. It's not a specific problem to us, but we have a severe housing crisis, and we have a severe affordable housing crisis and a housing affordability crisis. I mean, there's so many just nuances and layers to this issue. We have a homelessness issue in Lexington. All of that stuff is tied together. So we are trying to attack this problem or the series of problems from a bunch of different angles, whether it's the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to build more affordable housing, or it's tenant protections, because we have 50% of Lexingtonians rent, right? So they are a significant portion of our residents who very often, whether it's in the court system, they're very underrepresented. They're not represented by council. They have a lot of disadvantages. So those are all things we're looking at, but it's such a complex issue. And if we tomorrow could pass some miracle laws to address housing, our housing situation will not change for at least 5 to 10 years, simply from the process of building new housing. And so I just have to kind of not be frustrated by all the things that I cannot control, and really just keep plugging away and keep working towards tackling these issues.
Yeah, what can citizen groups or committed citizens do to help with easing the housing crisis in Lexington?
I think honestly, just keep speaking out, keep writing us, keep letting us know what your priorities are. And one of the interesting and really kind of frustrating elements happens here too. Like, there are a lot of folks, and this is a constant sort of decades-long conversation now in Lexington, is the idea of expansion versus infill. We in Lexington have a very unique character in our horse country. We are not like a lot of other mid-sized cities where we have this kind of sprawling metro area. If we did, we would have absorbed Winchester and Versailles and Midway and, you know, Berea and all these places by now, but we haven't. We have this sort of like, you know, you can drive 15 minutes and then you're in rural agricultural horse country. And I think that's really a part of our character, what draws business here, what draws visitors here. But we have a severe housing crisis as well. So we have to start looking at our zoning and building processes. And what happens a lot of times is a developer will come into an area and say, we want to rezone this area and put up this kind of housing or apartments. And what we run into, you know, in short, is NIMBYism, is not in my backyard. We have a lot of folks who philosophically agree that they want to preserve the integrity and the essence of Lexington with horse country and preserving agricultural land. But folks get upset at things being built next to them. And we're not even talking necessarily saying, here's a single family home neighborhood, we want to put high rises. But often even things like duplexes, even things like other single family housing that's maybe slightly more dense, it gets pushed against. So I would urge folks to kind of really take a look at that. Like, I get that. I totally get that. You live in a neighborhood, you have kind of a standard of living and a kind of a life and a kind of vibe that you like in that neighborhood. And change is always hard and change is always a little bit scary. And I think it's important for neighborhoods and neighborhood associations to come out and say, hey, here's what we want and here's what we don't want. We don't want our neighborhood to change in this kind of negative way. But really to have to balance that with like, what is going to happen to our city? Do we want to end up like Nashville or Austin, Texas, where none of our wage workers, none of our retail and restaurant workers can afford to live in Lexington anymore, where we go well over 50% of our workers. Right now, it's 50% of our workers live outside of Lexington. Do we want to be in a situation where 80% of our workers live outside of Lexington because they can't afford to live here, right? So it's that really, really delicate balance that we have to figure out.
Yeah, and a related question that's just come up in the chat is what your thoughts are on increasing short-term rentals and their impact on our housing and affordable housing issues in the city.
Sure. So we have a couple of council members that are taking the lead on potentially putting through a short-term rental registry. I'm a big data-driven person. I don't want to create solutions until I know what is the problem, what is the scale of the problem, how does our problem compare to other cities, have we tackled it before, et cetera. So at the very least, what this would move towards is knowing how many short-term rentals we have in Lexington. Right now, that number is nebulous. I've heard everything from 700 to 1,400. It'd be nice to kind of nail that down and see like how many units are we talking about? Who owns these units? Are these units owned by a couple of local folks, or they're renting part of their own house that they live in? Or are these LLCs and companies from out of state that own 46 units in Lexington or own a whole bunch of them in one neighborhood? I would like to know that and know what the impact of the problem is. What districts and neighborhoods is this impacting? Do we have a district that has a disproportionate number of short-term rentals? So I think it's definitely part of the impact of our affordable housing issue. It's certainly not the only thing, but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to pivot sort of broader. We've talked about some local issues. One question we had for you is that we live in an era of increasing misinformation, particularly about government and how it runs and civic life. What do you see as the role of local officials like yourself in helping ensure that voters have accurate information? And also, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what citizens can do to help contribute to more accurate information.
Yeah, I think we obviously have to make sure that we put out accurate and truthful information. I think there's a tendency now in sort of our news cycle and in our social media cycle. It is very easy for anybody to put out some misinformation that seems really hot and really, vital and really jarring. And often, and I've been guilty of it myself, we immediately share it because it confirms our bias. If we say like, oh, this company is doing this again, well, of course they are. And so I'm going to share and like, how terrible is this company? And then, 9 hours later, find out like, oh, that's not actually what happened. And I just was a part of that. So I think for everybody to kind of slow down and really engage the critical part of their brain and say, does this make sense? And what happens a lot of times too in items that we're working on at the local level. So for example, some of the tenant issues that we're working on, I've heard a lot of people push back and say, well, we don't want this to happen and we don't want that, and that's terrible, when none of that stuff is on the table at all, when none of that stuff's being even discussed. And so I'm always, crinkling my eyebrow and thinking like, where did this come from? Who came up with this? And some of it is misinformation in that people misinterpret it or things are getting out of hand. But some of it is disinformation from people who oppose the thing, and then they create a whole different narrative and then they spread it. So it is incumbent on us to be able to come out and respond to it and say like, no, actually, that's not at all what we're talking about. Here's what we're actually talking about. Or that's not at all what the actual data is. Here are the sources, right? So for us to kind of constantly be on the side of objective truth as much as possible. But we live in such a sort of a hyper-partisan time where everybody has their own little corners that they can back into. They have all their own sources of information that they trust. And I've always said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. You are not entitled to your own facts.
Yeah. What sort of in this climate, what opportunities do you see for citizens to come together and have some of these hard but productive conversations? And do you think city government should play a role in facilitating some of those?
Yeah, I think we absolutely have a role in that. I'll give a shout out to a local organization here called LWVLEX that does really, really great work in civic education and engagement. They did a fantastic job this past year with On the Table, this wide-ranging survey of Lexington. And they really kind of opened it up to asking folks, what are you concerned about? And some of those results were surprising, which was great because we don't always have a pulse on what people are thinking about. So they do a lot of great work. We tried to do as much engagement as possible, but there is obviously sort of inherent distrust in certain communities of the government. And I don't blame them. I mean, historically, governments haven't always served folks or haven't always served folks equally. There are people in certain communities that don't feel served at all, that they feel that they're targeted, that they are neighborhoods that have been redlined, and systematically and systemically, kept down. So we as government officials have, I think, a very steep hill to climb to build that trust back up. And we do that by constantly engaging with folks and letting folks know that we are listening and we are taking their thoughts into consideration and making an effort to engage with communities that have been underserved or marginalized, to say like, no, we are actually listening to you, not just folks who have influence, not just folks who have access. So we as city government have to kind of widen those avenues. One of the things we're looking at right now is improving our public engagement and public input piece. We're trying to bring in some technology that's going to make that a little bit easier. And we're trying to figure out all the right places for public input to happen. I would love to see us as government get out into the community more and not just do every single thing in the government building and ask people to come to us. I would love to have more regular engagement in those communities and go to the people. So we have work to do for sure.
Yeah, and on sort of in that spirit, one question we had was, so in the past, in your, this came up in your bio, you've spoken about an additional level of assistance for immigrants, especially in Lexington. And this is sort of another layer of assistance after, say, the Lexington Refugee Ministries. So organizations that could help these individuals become citizens, integrate into our society, integrate into our economy. What progress do you see Lexington as having made in this area? And, what work is left to be done?
There's a lot of work left to be done. I think this kind of work is by and large going to be incumbent on nonprofits to do. And this is something I think from the city level we want to support, because ultimately it's about letting our residents be as able as they can to be to be full-time, members of our city, of our society, whether that's economic, whether that's language. I mean, there's so many barriers. I went to recently they have this regular Friday, like New American orientation at Kentucky Refugee Ministries. And one of the questions that somebody from that community asked was, hey, when we go take our driver's tests and we can't understand the instructor, we would love to have another person in the car who can interpret for us, but that's not legal. Like by, I think, state statute, that you can't have a third person in the car. And so I saw that, I was like, I was like, that is a barrier. And that to me should be a reasonable accommodation that we can make, but that would take a legislative change at the state level, which, as we know, is going to be very hard. So I'm always looking for workarounds and different ways to tackle problems, but it's one of those things that you don't really think about if you're not part of that community. If that's not an issue that you face directly, it's not something I thought about. And when that came up, I was like, yeah, that is a huge barrier. When you can't drive a car, that limits you so much in terms of your economic productivity, of getting your kids to doctor's appointments, school, all those kind of things. It becomes really difficult. So there are all these sort of layers of things beyond just bringing people into the country and getting them set up. KRM does fantastic work, but they don't have the capacity or the purview to kind of follow these folks for the next 5-6 years, right? It's not within their work to take somebody, let's say as an example, you're a Ukrainian doctor and you come here and you don't speak English, and so you drive Uber for the first couple of years, right? How do we transition that person and take all the knowledge and experience that they have from their country, and how do we parlay that into things that they can use here and move them up economically and add them to our medical community? things like that. I would love to see folks work on that stuff. And those are the kind of things that I hope that our city government will help support.
Wonderful. So I have sort of two last questions for you, and then I'll open it up for others to ask questions. One is that you are Lexington's first Asian mayor, and we'd love to hear what that means to you personally. And then the second question is, then this came up in the chat earlier, is sort of who do you turn to? Who are your mentors when you have questions or doubts or, want to just talk with someone about what's happening in your work?
Yeah, I will say, being the first of anything, my biggest hope is that the next person after me won't have to be the first. My hope is that my daughter, who just is about to turn 18, by the time she gets to hitting those kind of milestones, I don't want her to be the first anything. I would like to live in a world where it's more commonplace. I would like to, because ultimately too, the thing with identity politics, what's interesting to me is that, let's say, as an example, the Asian American community really wants to elect an Asian American council member. But let's say I'm not that great of a candidate. Let's say they don't actually like me. What do you do in that circumstance? Do you support this person because you so desperately want representation in that way, but I'm your only choice and I'm not great, right? If we had a race that had multiple people from multiple different backgrounds, then you can pick the best candidate out of the bunch that you don't have to consider, identity politics as much. So that's my hope. For me, I'm not about just setting milestones or saying I'm the first Asian American vice mayor. What I really want to do is bring the experience and perspective I have as an Asian American, as an immigrant, to the table. Things like, thinking about the interpreters for driver's licenses, things like that. That's a perspective that I don't think would be here if I didn't have that connection with these kind of communities. In terms of mentors, I've been so grateful to be absolutely surrounded by all this institutional knowledge here in this government and all these really, really great folks that I can turn to ask about anything. There is so much coming at us right now that is complicated, nuanced, sometimes arcane, full of acronyms, just hard to dig through. And I can call up anybody in government and say, hey, can you come down and take an hour and explain the urban services boundary to me, and explain the zone change process to me, explain how our budget process works. I'll shout out two people in particular. Our council administrator, Stacy Maynard, has been fantastic helping us transition into this role and answering literally every question I have. And then we also have a terrific chief administrative officer, Sally Hamilton. That role is basically kind of like a city manager role. She kind of just makes things happen. She's like, anytime I don't quite know where to bring a question to, I will text Sally and say like, hey, how do we do this? And she points me in the right direction. And it's a really terrific role. So I wouldn't even say I have particular mentors. I talk to folks, on this floor that I respect and that I want to work with. And, I have several colleagues that I go to who have more experience than me to kind of just run stuff by them. And it's just been great conversation. So I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah, thank you so much. While folks are thinking of their questions, anything that you would like to talk about that we haven't asked you about in this conversation?
Well, I will say, in addition to my last answer, I will say one of those colleagues that I really enjoy working with happens to be on this little Zoom call. So, hello, Councilmember Sheehan.
Any questions, comments, thoughts?
Don't be shy. No, and I'll just say I really appreciate the work that you all do for civic engagement and the democratic process as a whole. I really enjoyed all the forums that I did last year that you all hosted. I attended a number of forums, and I don't want to disparage anybody else, but you all ran a really tight ship. I I am a person that runs a real tight meeting. You can ask any of my colleagues, and I appreciate people who can get it done, hit that timer, let people know when their time is up. I mean, I appreciate it. Y'all do a great job of that.
Well, thank you so much, Vice Mayor Wu, for being here. We really appreciate it. I think we'll let you go a couple minutes early. So
Okay.
hope you have a lovely weekend, and thank you
Thank
so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Take care.